Hey everybody, my name is Dominic Frederickson, and today I'll be giving my presentation for cultures and cuisines throughout the world in my NUFS 144 class, and I'm going to be giving it on Filipino cuisine and Spanish influence today. So, as stated, I'm Dominic, and this will be my presentation today. Just wanted to kind of, start off the presentation by showing you the Filipino flag as well as some of the two dishes that we have here that kind of represent more native Filipino cuisines, as we're going to talk about more Spanish inspired Filipino cuisines. But we have up top left is going to be what most people are familiar with, which is going to be lumpia, which is typically, a rice paper wrapping that they use around different types of fillings. They can be either savory or sweet, where you typically have kind of a pork or a chicken ground up mixture that they use for the savory ones with different vegetables such as carrots and things like that, as well as the sweet variety where they use sometimes bananas or things like that that are readily available and given with more sugars and things like that for a more sweet lumpia. To the right, we have a very famous Filipino soup called sinigang, which is very popular. Throughout Filipino culture. Different types of meats and stuff in there, as well as potatoes and okras and different things like that make their way into that dish. So very kind of flavorful soup using tamarind. Just to give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about here today. The first thing we're going to talk about is going to be native Filipino history and cuisine. So that's going to have to deal with, kind of the native people that were here before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, and kind of how those people were, mixed with different Austronesian cultures that came before the Spanish had even arrived, as well as kind of touch on some of their cuisines and things that they ate as well. Then we're going to talk about Spanish colonization, which, like I stated, started in the 16th century and ended all the way until the 19th century. So you have nearly 300 years of continuous Spanish occupation and colonization through the Filipino islands. From there, we're going to talk about how that Spanish influence on Filipino cuisine took shape through the different ingredients, different types of cooking styles, and things like that that they kind of indoctrinated into Filipino cultures and cuisines. We're going to touch on roughly about three dishes, so we'll touch on those three dishes uh, during that time, as well as then we'll dive into the kind of conclusion and wrap this PowerPoint up. But just to touch on the point up there in the top right, we see the map of the Philippines, and that'll kind of touch on the different overviews of the dishes. As you can see, the Philippine Islands, there's hundreds of them throughout. There's different kind of microcultures and subcultures throughout the hundreds of islands of the Philippines. So we see that even though these might be dishes that might be Spanish influenced or inspired, we're also going to touch on how different regions of the Philippines were able to take those types of cooking styles and ingredients and kind of make it their own as well. So just kind of give you the background on that. First off, we're going to talk about the native Filipino history and the cuisine. A term given to the original native Filipino culture and people that were there is what the Spanish called the Negrito population, which were kind of these people that had found the island through different migrations and have lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Um, we see these first groups of people start to sell. These first groups of people start to settle the islands that are now known as the Philippines in those early kind of times. They were nomadic groups of people that ate a variety of vegetation, whether it be different types of leaves and things like that, or different types of roots, which we're going to talk about here in a sec, as well as animals from the land and the sea, as well as the air too. They did eat birds and things like that as well. But their diet consisted mostly of foraged wild tubers, fish, and game meat. So to touch on what a tuber might be, if you're not familiar, it's going to be most of your root vegetables, which are going to be your carrots, your things like that, different root-based items that come from the ground that are readily available to be processed and eaten through that way of harvesting them and going out and getting them. So that's kind of a mainstay for them in those early diets, as well as wild boar and things like that that were readily available on the different islands as well. Seeing different type of fishing techniques, as we stated, there's hundreds of islands. It is a nation of islands, so you have different types of fishing techniques and things like that. So we want to demonstrate that off with a picture of what fishing in those early times in the Philippines might have looked like. The next thing we're going to talk about is still dealing with Native Filipino history and cuisine will be outside trade and influence of Native Filipinos. We started to see, as I had stated, with different ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines deriving from these original groups of people that migrated to the islands. Uh, we see a large amount of Austronesian migration coming from up north near Asia, Thailand, China, different places, Japan, things like that, that found their way into the Philippine islands. And from there, we get different kind of subcultures of those people mixing, like Ilocano, Visayan, and Tagalog begin to pop up throughout the islands due to these mixing and meetings of cultures, as well as a big influence on early native Filipino cuisine. You start to see early trade with some of these uh, more powerful Asian countries and groups, especially with China. You start to see new ingredients that pop up, such as rice noodles and different spices that might not have been readily available for them that are now being brought to the islands and people are starting to use. So with rice noodles, you get things like we're saying with lumpia, with people using rice paper, as well as um, different types of pansets and noodles and stuff like that that we see today. That picture in there in the bottom right, kind of shows that Austronesian migration coming up from Thailand and Vietnam and Laos and those different countries making their way into the islands in the South Pacific. So you see up top too, in the right, we have a kind of just a base picture of what some rice noodles might have looked like back then. Now we're going to dive into the Spanish colonization of the country. We're going to discuss from the early contact periods in the 1500 or early 16th century all the way up until 1898. The earliest colonization that we see between the Western world, or sorry, the earliest known contact point between the Western world and the native Filipinos took place in the early 16th century. Spanish explorer Ferdinand Magellan, who we commonly know him as the guy that the Spanish sent to circumnavigate the globe, had made contact with the Philippines in the 1520s. It was actually an interesting side note. He would actually die in the Philippines due to a battle of trying to indoctrinate the locals under Portuguese and Spanish rule to try to get them to follow suit. Didn't work out well for him. It wasn't until the 1570s when the Spanish came and actually officially conquered the islands. They brought a number of hundreds of thousands of troops from Mexico and surrounding colonies that they had, as well as people from Spain to come and kind of to overtake the islands. And that's what they did to kind of establish a hub in the Pacific for trading and things like that. So we see that taking place in 1570 when Spanish officially came and conquered the islands and established it with Spanish rule. There's continuous Spanish rule and law up until 1898. There might have been different times where they might have been warring with different countries, and different parts of the islands were taken by the Dutch or the French or things like that. But for the most part, from 1565 until the end of the Spanish-American War, when the Spanish lost to the Americans, and the U.S. purchased the land or the islands from them in 1898. So nearly almost 300s of kind of indoctrination and culture or colonization on these people. And there's, as we'll touch here in a minute, there's different types of influence that this is going to have on the Filipino cultures and cuisines. Spanish colonization of the Philippines brought many things with it, from the indoctrination of Catholicism to mixing of Spanish into the languages. I know there's a variety of different languages spoken on the hundreds of islands that are different versions of what we know as Tagalog today, where they do use Spanish numbers and phrases and things like that in their everyday languages as well. So you see that infusion, as well as what the most important thing we're going to talk about here is the ingredients and different cooking styles being influenced into the native diets. So the first thing we want to talk about is going to be these new ingredients that are coming over from either the Mesoamericas and Central America or from the Spanish itself. But the four biggest ones that I think that influence the dishes that we see um, in Filipino culture today are going to be maize, which is corn as we know it today, chili peppers and different types of peppers coming from all the different types of colonies that the Spanish had, as well as tomatoes and potatoes. Those two are huge in Filipino dishes that have Spanish influence in them. Excuse me. Uh, Not only did the Spanish bring their Spanish ingredients as well as Mesoamerican ingredients get added to the diet, but they also brought different ways of Spanish cooking, which we're going to touch on these next three dishes, like we stated, which is going to be a sofritos, which is type of stewing method or sauteing method, braising method that the Spanish used. And they brought it over, and Filipinos kind of took as their own as well as touching on sausage making, which is a huge part of their culture that they brought from the Spanish over to the Philippines. And we see different types of sausages that they make, but we're going to touch on a specific type of sausage here on these next slides, as well as bread making. Bread making, wheat flour and things like that being brought over from Spain and brought to these people so that they're able to make more types of breads and consistent things like that, which will be one of the main dishes we'll talk about today, which will be empanadas, as you can see right there in the middle. With Filipino empanada specifically, as well as just kind of I think it's an interesting thing that they named this bread, but this bread here in the far right that we see down in the right corner there is kind of like this mochi-like bread, which almost looks like a mini muffin or something like that, but it's called puto bread, Puto. Yeah, definitely an interesting name if you speak Spanish, but yeah, it's this kind of almost mochi-like texture bread that they eat with breakfast or with coffee or even as a dessert. That's really good. It's sweet, but it's not overly sweet. It has a nice, kind of doughy taste to it. It's very good. The first dish that we're going to touch upon today is going to be a Filipino longanisa. It originated from Spanish longanisa, as we talked about. Sausage making was a big thing that the Spanish brought over with them. Uh, as we said, the longanisa is a version of longaniza sausage, which was the Spanish version, or what some people might be familiar with is the Portuguese version of linguiça, which is kind of this ground up meat style sausage, which is very similar to a chorizo. Um, yeah, so the Filipino version, known as linguiça, is almost a sweet version made up of ground meats. So different, there's different porks, chickens, beef, any type of ground beef or ground meat that you could get. They're going to cure it up with these different types of spices, and it's what we know as longanisa. As I stated, it's more of a sweet version, whereas you're going to get more of a spicy or savory version with the Spanish longaniza or linguiça through the Portuguese. Um, there are different types of longanisa, as we stated. There's many different types of islands, so you get um, very different types of longanisa being made. So we're going to touch on that. The first one's going to be chorizo de Cebu, which is our example down in the bottom left there. It's a pork longanisa made in the Cebu region of the Philippine Islands, and they, kind of take their more kind of thicker link, kind of longer, where they skewer them up and do it like that. Versus the one in the middle here, we have Alaminos longanisa, which is longanisa that's going to come from Pangasinan, uh, which is more of a. They almost look like fingerling potatoes, and they bring them up real short and tight and make these sausages like that. Typically, longanisa is going to be made with breakfast, as we can see there to the right. A very popular Filipino breakfast is going to be, some fried eggs with fried garlic rice, as well as some tomatoes to kind of cut the grease. And the center of the dish you'll see there is longanisa. So, kind of pan seared, do it on there and serve it up for breakfast. It's very good. Next up, as we stated, is going to be Filipino empanadas. Most people are probably familiar with an empanada. An empanada, quick background there, I have the definition, is a Spanish filled pastry that can be either baked or fried. They're typically filled with savory meat and vegetable mixtures, can be sweet also. Um, as we stated, them bringing wheat flour over to the Philippines was something that was very big and something that the native Filipino people started to use to make their own breads and things like that. So bread making became very popular in the Philippine Islands through the Spanish occupation, which is why empanadas became so popular. Filipino empanadas, typically similar to a Spanish empanada or from different areas, throughout that they occupied, are going to consist of a beef or pork mixture accompanied with potatoes, chopped onions, and can be used sometimes with raisins as well to kind of sweeten up the kind of savory mixture that goes in there. As stated the same way with longanisa, you have uh, different types of empanadas being made depending on where you are in the Philippines. So, like before, we have Cebu, which is going to use more of a pork chorizo type sausage mixture. Going to be a little more spicy. They're going to use a chayote, which is a fruit, kind of like this almost green like fruit. They're going to dice up real thin and mince it and add it into that pork mixture as well to kind of give it also a sweet flavor as well. But we're going to see here it's going to be a deep fried and sugar dip. So, you get the deep fry and the sweetness coming from the sugar mixed with the saltiness and savoriness of the pork chorizo. Um, just one way that they do it. The next one's going to be Kapampanyan, which is going to be a sweet custard and a cashew filled empanada, and it's going to be deep fried as well. But more of a dessert or kind of a snack type empanada where they're going to use a sweet kind of custard mix and add these chopped cashews in there as well, and then they're going to deep fry it as well. That bottom left picture there, where we have a variety of different type of um, Filipino empanadas. The one on the far left there that looks kind of has a purplish hue to it is going to be your probably something with an ube base or something like that. Ube is a sweet potato that's native there and it grows and it has this purplish color to it. Some people might be familiar with it, but we get all different types of empanadas. You can see the one right next to the there with the four different labeled empanadas. It's going to have a sisig empanada, which sisig is going to be pork face and jowl, kind of the jaw area of a pig, and they're going to chop that up real thin and then mix it into their empanada as well as a basic chicken empanada and things like that. Lastly, we're going to talk about a ginisa, which is a Filipino sofrito. So sofrito is typically a stewed base or sauce that's mixed with some meats or aromatic vegetables and spices. It's kind of a base. It's almost like a tomato sauce, if you would, if you're thinking of it in almost like an Italian dish. But the Spanish version is typically going to consist of garlic and onions and pepper and cooking oil, and can add in tomatoes and or carrots, and is braised over low heat over long periods of time. So they're going to take low heat, long periods of time, let everything break up, kind of take down the fibers and all the foods, and kind of make it into this stew, kind of mushy, almost paste. With the Philippine Islands being occupied by the Spanish, they took their own version and they call it what we know as ginisa, which is a Filipino version of a sofrito. The word ginisa in Tagalog, which is the more popular tongue in the Philippines, is actual ginisa means saute in that word or in that language. So we see that the typical Filipino ginisa is going to be created with a base of onions, garlic, and tomatoes sauteed together with the cooking oil over low heat. So kind of the same vibe that the Spanish one uses. They took it and made it their own, and they added it into their dishes. Different types of stews, different things like that are going to have that kind of braised tomato kind of texture to it. It uses three of the dishes or two of the dishes that they didn't have before, which is garlic and tomatoes before the Spanish came and occupied the country and kind of added these kind of mixtures into their own dishes. So we see them being able to take a Spanish cooking method and ingredient and taking and combining them and adding it into their own way. Yeah. So in conclusion here, as stated, with the nearly 300-year occupation, there's going to be a lot of good and bad that come with these mixing of cultures and cuisines. As we stated, the changing from their native tongues to having to learn Spanish and things like that, as well as getting used to Catholicism and kind of the oppression that led from that as well. There were a lot of bad things, but there were a lot of good things that came from this mixing of cultures. And I would say that one of the big things is the mixing of some of the foods and different things that we see. The biggest being them adding their ingredients, a lot of different spices and things like that into it, so that they were able to, add in and create a different type of environment of food that was being created. So as stated, these cuisines with the mixture of this has created some of the most vibrant, beautiful, and flavorful food combinations that we've seen. Different types of ingredients that they use create these beautiful, complex, and flavorful dishes. Um, the one thing that I would lastly do is encourage you to go find a Filipino restaurant in your area that you live in. If you're lucky enough to live in the Bay Area, because I know this is an online course, there's a variety of different, kind of to-go places that are going to have different Filipino foods, as well as some sit-down restaurants in Oakland and San Francisco and places like that that offer, a very authentic and quality experience of Filipino food. So if you do have the ability to go out and do that, I would definitely recommend it. If you have not, go experience it today. But yeah, as stated, I'm Dominic Frederickson, and this was my presentation on Filipino food, culture, and cuisine, and how it was influenced by the Spanish. Thanks. Have a great day. Hope you enjoyed listening.